Thanks a lot for having me here. It's always a pleasure to come back to DC. I haven't got a presentation, I've got 3 graphs for you. But the story I'm going to tell today comes from my recent experience as an author and also the kind of editorial work I do for European studies, especially on papers working on energy. I've realized that when it comes to Central Asia, we have this very clear distinction between studies that only look at the geopolitics of energy in Central Asia, so the ground narratives or connectivity, not as you mentioned before, this connectivity per se doesn't exist. Or we have the very local impact. So what happens in the canal system in Uzbekistan if there is the problem with the food water energy nexus, or what happened in Kazakhstan, local rural areas when there are fuel shortages. There are virtually no studies that try to connect centralized policy making at Central Asia level in terms of energy and the impact that this decision, positive or negative, usually negative, have on the valley population. So in general, what I'm trying to say is that our interpretation of energy security in the last 10, 15 years in Indonesia has been essentially focused on what the regime wants us to believe. We are not looking beyond the energy security of the local population. And this is a mistake, I reckon, because we're missing the big dichotomy we're seeing there. My paper, in general my research, focus on the 2 hydrocarbon states, Kazakhstan, oil mostly, and Turkmenistan, mostly gas. So, and the point that I'm trying to make is that we've seen in the last couple of years especially, and in Turkmenistan is ongoing and drastically negative, we have seen the impact on the population of the specific policies of energy made by the leadership in Astana and Ashgabat. So what I'm trying to say is that we need to look a little bit more precisely at what's happening on the floor while studying the policies made in order to unveil the impact that the authoritarian logic of energy policy making is having on localized issue of energy usage. And to be more specific, I brought you 2 cases. The cases of the Kazakh production crisis and the case of the Turkmen export crisis. In this context, though, I need to make a bit of a general sort of proposition here, is that when you study the making of energy policy, you have to look at the Gulf, first of all, the Gulf states, because they are very similar to Central Asia in the context in which you have non-democratic regimes ruling over not very big communities and politics, so generally small population, and having a very clear energy social pact, in which the kind of exchange between the regime and the population is that the population will always be energy secure. That's why you've never seen that kind of energy shortages in Abu Dhabi or Dubai. That's why they go to Kazakhstan to buy uranium to the nuclear, which seems to be a contradiction, but it's not. So these regimes, which are anti-regimes, or regimes that survive on the export of single or one resource, are modifying their understanding of these resources, adjusting it to the era of climate change and the era of low oil prices. That's why there is this all sort of higher literature that looks at what they call late rentierism. So the evolution of how petrostates are adjusting to the changing situation. And they've got 2 different theories about it, but in general it's a stage program. And what I notice is that Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan are left at the very primordial level of this development. They haven't really adjusted their way of making energy policy to the pressure of climate change or to the priorities that come with low prices. And we've seen that, especially in the way in which they introduce or manage, if they have it, oil funds in the way in which they respond to globalization and in the way in which they respond to the pressure posed by external proposals or cooperation with independent of energy actors. So in that sense, we see that Kazakhstan is a little bit more advanced than Turkmenistan because it's a more open country. You've got possibilities for onshore and offshore cooperation when it comes to PSAs and joint ventures, and it's many because an oil fund, which is controversial per se, but there's oil or a fund nonetheless. Whereas in the case of Turkmenistan, we are really looking at the classic example of a Gulf state in the 20s and 30s, in which there is export of one resource, everything is nationalized, there is virtually no cooperation, and with foreign actors. And in the case of Turkmenistan, it's allowed only for the offshore fields. So you can have a PSA with a Turkmen state if you want to drill a hole in the Caspian. You can't have one if you want to have one onshore, of course, exceptionally CNPC with the Batyr leak in Le Bab El Ayat. So my point here is that, these differences in which these two states are responding to the inevitable alteration that Rantier logic of resource development or exploitation, if you want, is asking them, has resulted in very different crises, different in intensity, different in production phase, different in negative impact, but they are still very much crises. So if you look at the experience of the Gulf, you don't really see the population be energy insecure. There is always a constant, affordable, secure flow of energy powering the economies of the Gulf states. In Central Asia, we haven't got that. We move from the experience of Uzbek teacher being asked to leave the class to get the wood to burn the fire. We've been used to the population in Kazakhstan queuing at the pump for oil shortages, and we've been used for the case of Turkmenistan, losing all the subsidies that they normally have. So this is the three examples, not Uzbekistan, but to which I do refer, that we do have a localized population-centered impact of authoritarian choices of energy management. The first example that I have here is Kazakhstan. So what I got here, I have, so the thicker red line is the, no, it's okay, it is the production, the evolution of production of Kazakh crude. And I put it in the same system with the RAF. This is not day by day, it's year by year, evolution of prices. And it seemed to me that we can draw a major conclusion here, that because of the regime obsession with Kashagat, Kazakhstan ended up producing more when the price was lower and less when the price was higher, which is not the best market decision you can make if you are what is essentially an oil exporting country. And so you could argue that the Kashagan issue is a defining problem of the late Nazarbayev era. It is, to my mind. I think that a lot of the politics, especially when it comes to the reaction to the ruble crisis, the valuation crisis of the government, those very long 6 months of indecision between massive spending or austerity, had to do with the regime obsession with Kashagan. Kashagan brought with it the infrastructural promise that only virtual projects have. TAPI brings with it infrastructural promise. Kashagan closed between 2 months of inauguration, was shut already, which determined, in that sense, the future choices of the Kazakh government. And it led to what essentially is a failure in sustaining production, which is the second, this is from The Economist, the EIU. And what it shows that the clear blue line and the red line are inflation in general terms, whereas the thicker blue line is how the diesel and gasoline prices have actually increased. And what we realized that in the last 6 months of last year, oil prices, diesel prices, went much higher up than inflation, which means that people had less money to buy this, to fill the tank. And to me, this is very much connected to the fact that production is not made for the population, but is made for the export, to sustain what the regime needs in order to achieve a whole series of ends which are more or less transparent. You decide which one you want to believe in. So to my mind, that's again, the encapsulates my point of impact of energy policy onto domestic issues. And to give more of context on that, the crisis happened when the government had to close down one of the 3 crude refineries in Kazakhstan, and the population had to rely on gas imported from Russia. So you got a very clear disparity between authoritarian logic and population energy security. But when it comes to energy failure, there's no one who can beat Turkmenistan. And this is, for me, the graph that captures in full the export crisis, which I have been writing about for a while, and this is taken from my last year article on the public pipeline. So this is production of export of gas in BCM between last decade. And it's very easy when you have so fewer customers that you can have 3 colors. Essentially, the red one is Russia, the green one is China, and the gray one is Iran. And what you notice is that across 10 years, you have a parabolic evolution of direction of trade. What was essentially a Russian monopoly when Yadzov died became a China monopoly 10 years after Yadzov's death. And you could say, well, look, this is all well. They still export 40 BCM, but as Alex Cooley mentioned this morning, they're not getting the same cash for the same volume, because the pay for purchase agreement that they had with China is rolling out in the phase in which they sell more gas, or even sell just any quantity of gas for no money at all. Which means that when the economy has not been diversified, and that's another clear indicator of what this later anti-realism really is about. Diversifying the economy for a post-oil scenario or a post-gas scenario, you realize that the government is no longer able to do what he needs to do and what he says he will do. 2 examples here, and then I'm closing down. The first one is that if you look at the very first inauguration speech that Berdimuhamedov gave in February 2007 when he was elected for the first time, you would see that after a couple of paragraphs of praise for his predecessor, he goes straight into pretty much promising that until I will be president, you will always have free gas, free electricity, and free table salt. Which is important because it shows what his regime was going to be about. Was going to be about, don't worry too much with reforms. He never mentioned reform. Mirziyoyev did, he never mentioned reform. And what he did was just saying, you're going to have this kind of subsidies. So the energy social pact that Berdimuhamedov promises collapsed when this China agreement rolled in. Second example, to show you the entity of this issue, is that what I've heard, that the government in the last month has asked, after months of ministerial restructuring, which means that you put ministry together so you get to pay fewer wages, has asked some employees in some ministries to take a month of holidays without pay, which means that they do not have the money to pay for the public sector, which is a big no-no if you are a rentier state. And look at Qatar. Qatar does that. That's how they survived through the Arab Spring. They kept pushing up the public sector pay. So I'm going to close down to leaving you with this idea that those of us who think about Central Asian energy, who write about Central Asian energy, should start to look at this third criterion when we look at energy policy. On the one hand, we have climate change, which is important because it will play a role. On the other one, we have low prices, because now it's going to be pretty much like a third. And the third one is authoritarian decay. Unless we start to think about these three criteria when we describe policy making in energy area in Central Asia, we're going to miss the point, and we'll then have trouble to justify the energy insecurity and the kind of local impact that these choices have made. Thank you.